I do think AI will eventually be a political leader, probably around 2050 or 2060. I think a major Western country will be run by an artificial intelligence. Yeah, I think politicians won't let AI replace them. I'm working on a doctor. My major secret project I can tell you guys about because it's coming out in a couple of days, maybe as soon as a couple of days. I'm not sure it's the exact day. Is an AI doctor. And I think that, doctors have for a long time, if anybody knows about medical costs and high prices of healthcare, it's me. Doctors have been the major cost of healthcare since the beginning. And I think it's time that we break the back of the cabal that is the American Medical Association. I don't have any problem with any individual doctor. I have many friends who are physicians. I always wanted to be a physician. Growing up, it was my dream. But I think that we spend too much on healthcare in this country, and the technological advances that we have will drop the price of healthcare just like it's dropped the price of compute, storage, communications, genome sequencing. All of those things have dropped not 90%, not 99%, but like 6, 7, 8 logs. You can't even describe the amount of nines easily. So the amount of compute has dropped, the cost of compute has dropped 10 logs. And that doesn't mean that we stop spending on compute. We spend even more on compute. So you can make a program that does a good chunk of the doctor's job. And I don't think you could stop it. I don't think you could regulate it. I think that, it's going to be better in some cases than some physicians. And, doctors won't go away. We'll just have more time with doctors. We'll just have more interaction with them. Instead of waiting for, 2 hours in a waiting room, maybe you'll wait for 1 minute. Instead of having 30 seconds to talk to the doctor, maybe you'll be able to sit there for 5 minutes because AI has taken some of the hard job away from it. So I think that AI works with society, works with the current framework we have. It doesn't just replace. It sort of replaces and provides ways to augment. So I think that whether it's a second opinion or whatever, we'll see.
Sorry. Yeah, if I could. I wanted to ask about your sense of how this AI boom or bubble will play out, and kind of along the lines of how you feel about maintaining jobs in face of a technology that could greatly impact the jobs. There's a sense where, as a general purpose technology, also it's like you get the electricity in your business, and how much is that really some company or a bunch of startups or a bunch of businesses all trying to get into the market, and how much of that is just OpenAI or Microsoft just feeding you the electricity, and then businesses that already exist
Sure.
boom that way. Interested in how you see this kind of playing out, and I guess as it gets closer to a general intelligence or a set of capabilities that can just replace all of our work. It's like if that's nearby or further away, how we move up towards that, and how that all plays out.
I actually think your question hits a lot on the head, and kind of the key point of this, which is, will the infrastructure layer beat the app layer? And the answer to that is almost never no. If you look back in history, the app layer always wins. So if you look at hardware in general, other than NVIDIA, hardware has generally kind of been a disaster for tech over long periods of time, where Microsoft and Google have sort of won on the software side. Obviously, Apple's is its own story too, but you generally win on the app layer, not the app software layer, not the infrastructure software layer. So the only company that's maybe notable on the infrastructure software side is Oracle and a handful of other infrastructure companies. But it's the actual app that wins. So much of the infrastructure side is open source or stuff that could be made open source, and there's no real great way to attack that with a commercial interest. Whereas on the app side, you can build a brand, right? You can build a Microsoft Excel. Nobody really cares about building a brand around an LLM. It's like, okay, this is the architecture that works. We're going to use this architecture, and that's it. The same way you don't think too hard about provisioning a web server. And if somebody tried to make you pay for web server code or something, you would immediately say, no way, I'm using Apache or I'm using Express or something like that. So the software side on the infrastructure side is, I think, very, very ephemeral and hard to monetize. And obviously, OpenAI has an API. They're making some money on that. But I actually think most of the money they're going to make is on ChatGPT. And that's an app layer, right? So they're kind of doing both. But I think the commoditized LLM is not going to be a great business. I think the people that take that LLM, and whether they point it to their own business and say, how do we become more efficient, or they make a business out of it and charge people to use lawyer in a box, doctor in a box, accountant in a box, you name it, that LLM could provide. Those are brands that can last and build, and people can use them like TurboTax or Excel or any of the other great software brands we know and love, Google. But you notice that none of the actual kind of infrastructure layer ever makes money in software. Hardware is obviously a different story. It's kind of, like I said, pretty mixed. You've got winners and losers, but ultimately I think software on the app layer is the highest margin, longest persistence, stuff like that. So I think those will be the companies that win. And the only real software that we've seen out of LLM so far is ChatGPT. So I think there's some time to carve out niches and win and compete. In terms of how the bubble actually plays out, it's very interesting. Tech caused a big reckoning in the crossover and hedge fund world for investing in privates. So I think that we'll see the same beginning of the bubble, which is venture funds chasing valuations and stuff like that. But I think the exits will be IPOs. And I think that, again, I don't have a crystal ball. I could be wrong here. But I think we will see like $5 billion, $1 to $10 billion kind of IPOs of AI companies with no revenue or limited revenue. And I think people will be okay with that. Now, remember in the tech bubble of 99 and 2000, it wasn't so much the large market caps. It was actually the number of $1 to $5 billion market caps. That there were a bunch of fly-by-night companies that went up and then went down, and that was it. You also saw a generic boom in tech valuations because of the internet, and you had stocks that didn't have much like exposure to the quote-unquote internet, and they still would go from like 15 or 20 times earnings to like 60 or 70 or 80 times earnings. Microsoft is actually fairly good describer of that, actually. All they had at the time was Office and Windows, and neither one was really particularly levered to the internet, but their valuation quadrupled anyway. So, I think that, I think people will be a little more rational about AI benefiting kind of all these companies, but you do see some of this starting to play out in the markets. Like Adobe's released an AI product. Microsoft obviously is going to be very exposed, but it'll be interesting to see other companies kind of try to get there. The problem is so much of these companies already sort of have this expectation that they'll deploy this new technology, how much it'll actually increase revenue and things like that. If we see real increases to revenue, like an extra 10% revenue a year or something like that, we will get a big bubble in every tech stock. But I don't know if we're going to actually get that, or we're going to see cost reduction, which the market's a lot less kind of excited about. So it's sort of a conundrum. Like, for there to be a bubble, there has to be asset prices that inflate. For their asset prices to inflate, there has to be assets with prices to begin with. And there's a boom. I mean, I've started a new AI product, and other companies, are being started by the day. I'm sure like 100 AI companies just started and got incorporated today. So everyone's going to try to take advantage of this boom, including the investors who will pump money into this stuff. But then the investors have to turn and put the hot potato somewhere else. And I think the stock market is probably more likely this time than the last several times where it was like these mega funds, SoftBank, hedge funds like Tiger. A lot of these folks are once burned, twice shy. And I think the public markets will be the place to sort of put all this merchandise. Yeah, so we are trying to, work with countries that have a lot of doctors at a low price. And that's kind of something that, could be a good training tool. I know that for GPT-4, that OpenAI employees stayed up all day and all night, doing RLHF, which, vastly improved their product. I do think, like, to the extent you can get, it's funny, I had this argument today, like I said, with our CTO, that, do we ever need single sources of truth or crystallized information anymore? And it's funny, we had this argument where I was like, no, we need some kind of single source of truth. We need this, like, basically, whether it's RDF or OWL, these ontology languages, some semantic representation of truth that this machine will know. And he's like, as much as you're talking my language, like, I feel like the weights hold all of that. And like, ultimately, if we train our model the right way, we don't need any database or index or anything that, can contain, that has to contain, or that isn't able to contain that core knowledge. And I'm just sitting there like, wow, how is that possible that there may be like this really deep well of information that I need to withdraw from like a database, and it's somehow still contained in this LLM?
I think there is like a lot of really, really deep knowledge inside these LLMs, but at the end of the day, there's just so much more room for exactness, so much more room for accuracy if you have like an actual real data source that's not just like relying on this like very it's just like it's like a collapsed memory of the internet, right? It's like a snapshot, but it's very compressed compared to the full internet, of course. Like GPT has a lot of parameters, of course, billions and billions, but that is nowhere near the size of what it was trained on.
Yeah, I mean it's scary, and because of its opacity, right? Like we don't have a viewer that allows us to go back into the provenance of the data and say, oh, this weight was isn't right, or something like that. It's just almost impossible to disentangle like the calculation. So I hope that there's still room for even if it's LLM trained like single sources of truth. But if we're past like a world where databases are no longer useful, it'd be quite a moment in time. Oh yeah. So of course I saw the Bloomberg GPT thing. I do think you'll see LLMs being used in custom use cases like that. I think training a real LLM is still prohibitively expensive. I don't even think Bloomberg example is really a good one. But I think like to train your own very large language model, I hope we don't get into VLLMs or ULLMs or something like that, but maybe we'll get there at some point. But to train your own language model is almost impossible, like to get something like the quality of GPT-4 or something like that. So on like a very narrow like data set, I think it's much more doable. And what Bloomberg did, I think anybody can do. So, but I still think like the LLM isn't the interesting thing. I think it's more about what do you do with it? Like, can it answer questions in an interesting way? Like, can you prompt engineer it to do things? So like one thing I'm doing is getting an LLM to read all of the news that comes out in any given day and then say, like, what did you think was the most interesting news release? And what stock move would you like suggest as a reaction to that news release? And you could potentially feed it quite a lot of stuff and use its reasoning to deploy interesting things. In terms of the government and politics type stuff, I mean, I think that we have to all kind of like aggressively participate in politics. And I wish that that wasn't the case because I certainly don't like it myself. But like the scary thing is that we're seeing our country transform quite a bit. I think that, maybe I'm just being psyoped, but like, I think like things like watching like the Biden administration and the Trump administration, to be frank, bungle through a lot of, mistakes and not sort of guide our country into a place where I think a lot of us want it to be is worrisome. And I think that, if you look at the probably the biggest thing that scares me is the representation of government in Congress does not reflect who we are. We have very few minorities in Congress. That's not just blacks and Hispanics, but also Asian Americans. You just never see them in Congress. And the average age of Congress is very old, and it doesn't represent the younger people, the middle-aged people, and so forth. And I think that it's very much, a labor, it's civil service, and that people from business have to increasingly move over. The only people that want to be politicians are lifelong politicians. And I think that is why when we look at Congress and government and the law, we get disgusted. It's funny, anybody can be a federal judge, but we only pick federal prosecutors to become federal judges, which is a really telling thing because they view things through the lens that they were trained in, which is as a prosecutor, which is that everyone's a criminal and that they have to meter out the justice. So a lot of people say when you go to trial in criminal court that you have two prosecutors, the judge and the prosecutor. And I think that's often the case. So I think like we have to like make the country we want. And, in many ways we're kind of let these interests and elements kind of like take over parts of the world and the country that most of us want to see get done differently. Thankfully, it's like fairly course corrective. Like politicians usually aren't totally tone deaf. And they'll respond to their interests. But I think there is a lot of messed up things going on, and I hope that someone past my pay scale and pay grade and intelligence can figure out the answer. We have Indian CEO of Microsoft. We have an Indian CEO of Google. We have an Indian CEO of Adobe, Indian CEO of IBM. Indians have done very well in America. They're the real American dream. They come to America and work. They come to America and study. They come to America and they don't commit crimes, by the way. In America, in prison, where I can give you firsthand, I've been to 3 prisons, 2,000 or 3,000 people each. I maybe met one Indian person, and he was wrongfully accused. So, these are people that have jumped into America and have fulfilled their American dream. They come from a dirt poor place. India's average GDP per capita is like $2,000. Come to America, and they're the highest earners in our country. I met a lot of Albanians in prison. And Albania, put it this way, Albania, and I'm Albanian, so I can say this. Albania has 3 million people, okay? India has 1.5 billion people. 3 million Albanians in Albania, 1.5 billion Indians in India. And I met 10 times as many Albanians in American prison than Indians. So, just think about it. It's a culture that prizes education, a culture that prizes respect, family ties, things like that. And Vivek, is I'm not saying he's perfect, I'm not perfect, he's not perfect, but he's a good dude, and I hope he makes it really far in politics, whether it's this term, next term, he becomes a senator or whatever, unlikely case, he becomes a president. I'm all for it. And we don't have minorities in Congress, right? We don't have younger people in Congress. And it doesn't make a lot of sense. Everybody in Congress is 100 years old. You got people in Congress where they talk about cryptocurrency or AI. They're sitting there thinking, what is going on? I don't even know what this is.